Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the Aspen City Council work session for June 3rd, 2024. And today we have one item on our agenda, and that is to review Bob's Rules of Order with Mr. Robert C. Is it Widner or Widner?
Widner.
Widner.
Yes.
Widner. Welcome, welcome.
Well, thank you. I understand I need to turn this on, so give me a moment. There we go. Mayor,
Thank you.
ready to go.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to, again, my name's Bob Widner. I wanted to thank you for the invite. It has been many, many years since I've been in Aspen. 1992, I came up and met with the city council that long ago to talk about financing options for urban renewal, some housing issues, and some land use issues. So it's been a long time since I've been here, and it has changed, at least from my perception. But it's been beautiful to be up here. And I got to tell you, I don't know what you got in the water, but my wife and I have been all over town, and every person we met are some of the friendliest people we've ever met. And so whatever you're doing it right. But again, thank you for the invite. I am before you today to talk about meeting procedures. And although meeting procedures aren't the sexiest or the most exciting thing you'll ever talk about, I hope they're at least interesting because they're important. And they're important for a very important reason. And that is because what we all strive to do in government is to make sure that we instill trust in the public in what we do, and confidence. And I can tell you from my 35 years of practicing municipal law, I can tell you that a dysfunctional, confused, and disorganized city council reflects very poorly upon the community, because the community believes everything you do is dysfunctional or messed up somehow. So what we want to do, and what our goal is in meeting procedures, is to make sure we operate in a way in which it's consistent and it appears to the public, because it will be, that we know what we're doing, that we know the procedures, we follow the same procedures all the time. So there is a benefit associated with the rules of procedure that we'll talk about today, and I'll talk about why I drafted Bob's Rules of Order. But again, it's coming from somebody who's done this for 35 years. I have been a city attorney in large cities, Arvada, as well as Centennial for the last 20 years. I've served communities as small as Hot Sulphur Springs, and many other communities across the state. So I've been there, done that a lot. But I'm also a very big geek when it comes to meetings and meeting efficiency. So you may come across me at CML because for 20 years I've been teaching this stuff, and you may see me in the future if you attend a CML conference. I want to first impress upon you, though, that although I'll give you some advice and I'll mention some things, what you need to understand is that your local attorney is far smarter, far wiser, and even better looking than I am. And whenever it comes to a question, you should defer to your city attorney, always. I may say something that doesn't fit with how you operate or how you wish to operate or what your historical practices have been. I don't know those things, but your local attorney does, so defer to your local attorney. As we talk about this stuff, please, if you have questions, inject them along the way. We'll have some time. We also, hopefully, will have some time at the end to talk about questions that you might have. But our goal is to go through meeting procedures and specifically rules of order. And if there's time permitting, I've been asked to also talk about remote meeting issues that are kind of ripe right now. I've spoken in a lot of communities across the state about how we conduct remote meetings and what are the problems associated with remote meetings and whether we even have to do remote meetings. So we'll touch upon those issues too if we have some time. So the roadmap for where we're going to go today, this afternoon, is I'm going to talk about bylaws and I'm going to talk about rules of order because they're different, and it's an important difference for you and for any community, for any local government. We're going to talk about why we need rules of order, and we're going to talk about Robert's Rules of Order specifically. As you know, you've adopted Robert's Rules of Order, which many, many, many communities have. And we're going to talk about why they don't work, and I'll be very frank with you about that. And we're going to also talk about Bob's Rules of Order as an alternative. And when doing so, we're going to talk about the book generally and the terminology, the points that are in there, the rules and the motions, and then hopefully leave time for questions. Again, I'll try to make this interesting, but if you have questions, jump in because that'll be most beneficial to you if you ask questions along the way. So bylaws versus rules of order. This is important. Bylaws are the organizational and management tools that you have. They're this document, and it can be many documents. It can be the state law, it can be your local rules that you have. It's basically how you organize yourselves. What is it you do? What kind of meetings do you hold? How you want to conduct your business. It's specific to you. It can't be generally copied by other communities and say, these are our bylaws. It's something you write down to govern how you want to reflect to your citizens. It can, again, come from your charter, from statutes. It can come from your policies that you want to draft on your own. And you do have some of this already drafted. Rules of order are different. Rules of order is how do we make a decision? How do we go from the point of entertaining some issue or some idea or some question and bring it to a conclusion? What are the processes we entertain in that situation? And those rules of order can be uniform among various bodies, and in fact they are. Many times governing bodies will cheat or rip off other governing bodies about their rules of order because rules of order should be consistent. It's basically how we go from one point to the other. Bylaws, just by summary, you'll see some of the issues that bylaws address. They address their purposes. What is it you're supposed to do? What powers do you wield? How are you going to deal with absences? How are you going to deal with excusing somebody when they're not here and present? How are you going to remove somebody from office? How are you going to call a meeting? What's the notice requirements going to be? What are your quorum requirements for specific meetings? What kind of voting methods are going to use? Rules of order, again, different. They are determining your quorum. Now that you know what quorum you need by your bylaws, how do you count the noses and make sure that you can conduct business? They deal with what are the powers of the presiding officer? What is the presiding officer supposed to do? Oftentimes called the mayor, right? We're going to disclose conflicts of interest. We're going to deal with how we disclose them, not what conflict of interests are. State law provides for a litany of things that are conflicts of interest. Your bylaws can do the same. Your bylaws can identify conflicts of interest. How you disclose them is in the rules of order. Are you going to have a motion that requires a second? That's a rule of order issue. How are you going to vote? Yes, no. Are you going to allow abstentions? We'll talk more about your practices here. And how do you suspend or deviate from this process of going from point A to point B in making a decision? Bylaws, when you break them down to their essence, are basically hardwired. This is a document or documents you'll have in your community that you don't change very often because what happens with the city council and how you deal with yourselves doesn't change. You want to know it's the same year after year after year. So it's more difficult to change your bylaws, whereas rules of order are easy to change. You can, from time to time, amend your rules of order as you wish. They're very different. And that your bylaws, as they have in your situation, the bylaws will adopt a specific set of rules of order. And your rules of order will, in turn, reflect back to your bylaws and say that you have to, during meetings, comply with both the rules of order and with your bylaws. There are connections there. But it's important to focus upon, as we talk about the importance of rules of order, what is a rule, how a rule is, and what is a ruleless meeting going to look like? It's going to look like this. It's going to be that any of you can speak anytime you wish. It doesn't matter that you're talking over somebody else. You just blurt it out. You get to go forward. It's oftentimes what I call the domination by the dominant. When I go into communities that don't have good sets of rules of order and they don't follow rules of order, it's basically the more dominant council members or board members are going to dictate what happens with regard to the meeting. They're going to dominate the meeting. You oftentimes will find a mayor that's too powerful or a mayor that's ineffective because there's no clear role for the mayor to play. And sometimes the mayors will take that role, the absence of a role, and go too far with it. There's no obligation, importantly, for the mayor, without rules, to grant you the floor. So the mayor can ignore you. The mayor can ignore everyone except the mayor's favorite people. I hope you understand this is not the kind of meeting that we run today in local government or we would ever tolerate. But this is the outshoot, the offshoot of a ruleless meeting without rules of order. We oftentimes will conflict with our First Amendment requirements and our due process requirements because due process is fairness. And First Amendment makes certain obligations upon us that we have to follow when we conduct our meetings. If we don't have rules, we will step in a pothole associated with those requirements. And in many communities I go into, they say, well, Bob, we don't really need rules of order because we self-police ourselves or we self-regulate ourselves. And I will tell you, invariably, those communities, when I watch their tapes, when I sit with them and watch what's going on, it just doesn't happen that way. Eventually, they get somebody who's obstinate on the governing body, and that person will create the kinds of problems that rules of order are intended to address. Importantly, when we don't have rules, we have nothing that we have to comply with. That ruleless meeting is true. If you don't have it written down, somebody says you must do it this way, the answer is, well, show me where it's written down. We don't have a rule on that. And the answer is we don't. And therefore, we don't have a rule. And therefore, you don't have to comply. This is a very important thing, and it plays out later on. We're going to talk about the converse of this idea of when you have a rule. But when you have no rules, you do not have compliance. This actually overlaps to some degree into land use matters. This is invariably where we see litigation associated with developers who are told to do things. You must do this. And when the developer looks back at you and says, where's the rule that says I must? If your answer is we don't have a rule for that, you cannot force compliance. That is a general rule with regard to how we operate as government. When we look to the benefit of rules of order, why we would do this, there's some important benefits that we got to look at, and I'll touch upon these briefly. The number one is fairness. When you have rules that you follow, we are going to do the same thing all the time, the same way. So if I'm before you as a developer or somebody's asking for some permission, I'm going to be treated the same way somebody else is. It's fair to me to know that you're not going to change the rules on me and how you decide my issue. So fairness is advanced by having a set of rules that you follow and having rules, period. Defending those decisions, when you have decisions that are made in accordance with a set process that you follow, it's much easier for lawyers to defend. I will tell you this, that if you look at all the case law in which municipalities get hung up in litigation, especially land use litigation, where they lose is not because of the decision that they made. It's not because they said yes and no oftentimes. It's because they didn't follow the right process. They messed up. And so having rules and understanding the rules and following them makes you somewhat ironclad when it comes to challenges by individuals who are upset with your decision. It's very hard to beat City Hall on the decision that's made. It's relatively easy to beat City Hall when they fail to follow the rules that they set up, or they don't have rules for what they did. And lastly, efficiency. We conduct meetings under rules of order so that they're efficient. An incredibly important reason why we have rules is that we can make sure we move from A to B to C to D the right way quickly. And if we don't have the rules, we're going to be very inefficient. In one of my small communities that I started with many years ago, they didn't have rules of order, and what I observed is that they handled every situation differently, and here's how it played out. What are we going to do here, Mayor? Well, we're going to do this. Okay, and then what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Let's talk about whether we should do that. And it became more of a exercise in deciding what we're going to do than just doing it, because they didn't have a practical set of rules that they could follow. Now, so we should know, and we should intuitively know that rules of order are good. But then the question is, what are the best rules of order? And they need to be reasonably simple and understandable. If you have very complicated rules that nobody reads, nobody understands, you're not going to follow them. They need to be tailored to what it is you're going to be doing, and you have to be reasonably comprehensive. You have to cover all the bases, because when you don't have a base covered, you don't have a rule, and you don't know what to do. We need to have flexibility in what we're going to do, in our rules, and we need to fit with what you do historically. And this is sometimes reflected in this issue of abstention, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then we have to make sure that we've all accepted them and we're going to follow them consistently. That's the best kind of rules to have. And so where are you going to find these kind of rules? Where do you go to find rules? You can get them off the internet. You can get them out of the library. You can get them from cheating off of other communities that might have rules of order. But these are the ones that you've adopted and that most communities have come across at some point in time, and they're ones that they've used, Robert's Rules of Order. This is the number one thing out there that purports to be the best rules for any kind of meeting. There are also a slew of books out there that you will find that tell you what Robert's Rules of Order says and how to follow them. And this is just some of the many, many books out there that tell you what Robert's Rules tell you to do. The problem is this: Robert's rules are 803 pages long. And I'm going to guess that none of you got a copy when you entered your office. And I'm going to guess, and this is not a slam on Aspen, it's a slam on just about everybody who's adopted Robert's Rules of Order, because it's true. But if you go into the community and try to find them, you won't. You won't find them in the city clerk's office oftentimes. Or if you do find them, they're in a drawer somewhere and pretty much nobody knows where they are. They're not good for government. They have 96 different motions that you would need to know in order to conduct business if you're going to follow Robert's Rules of Order. And they're very good for large legislative bodies, like the state legislature, which follows them. But for you, it's very difficult to use 803 pages and quickly figure out what you're supposed to do. I challenge anyone to use Robert's Rules on the fly, on the floor, to make a decision. Many of the rules in Robert's Rules directly conflict with Colorado law. So you would be adopting a set of rules that do conflict with what you're supposed to do by law. And there's going to be very many unacceptable procedures for local government in there. For example, you might be surprised to learn, if you're supposed to follow Robert's Rules of Order, that the mayor is not allowed to speak except informally. That's in Robert's Rules. Robert's Rules allows the mayor to clear the room of the citizens for no reason, just to clear it. Has that power. There are many other things in Robert's Rules. For example, unless you take an exception that's in there, you must stand when you speak. And no one does that. Nobody in government wants to conduct their business that way, yet we've adopted rules that say we're supposed to do that. They do not recognize quasi-judicial procedures. They do not tell you how to conduct your business when you have a quasi-judicial application before you. They completely miss it. 803 pages uses the word quasi-judicial process one time, and merely as a note that quasi-judicial is something that government does. So the rules don't help you in defending yourself or creating efficiency when you're using them for quasi-judicial processes. And as they are, they're just, if you adopt them straight up as they are, they're just not usable for you. You would have to amend a significant portion of Robert's Rules to make it work for you. But yet we've all adopted them. Communities across the state have adopted them. So we're supposed to follow them. So going back to the idea that if you don't have rules, you don't have compliance requirement. If you have a rule, you're supposed to follow it. So here, if you've adopted Robert's Rules, what you're saying is we're going to follow these rules. And if you follow Robert's Rules, somebody could say, I'd like to make a point of order under Robert's Rules that the mayor is not allowed to speak except informally. And they'd be right, because that's the rule you adopted. Most of us, if not all government, has ignored much of Robert's Rules, even though they've adopted them. You will find a bunch of other stuff. I just mentioned this because I've been hit with it in presentations for the last 20 years. Yes, there are other documents out there that are not Robert's Rules. They try to run around Robert's Rules, just like Bob's does, but they try to run around. But I have found that they're too simplistic, or they're not really rules at all. If you read them, they're just a discussion of what makes for a good meeting. They're not rules. But what I don't want anyone to do, and the reason why hopefully I'm before you and I'm before other governing bodies across the state, is that if you have rules that are too complicated, that require you to go back to them time and time again, you're letting these rules conduct your business. They'll wag the dog, the tail will wag the dog. The rules are become more important than the decision process that you make. And that's what we need to avoid. So yes, you can use Robert's Rules of Order if you want them. You can use them. You're going to have to amend them or ignore them. You can find some custom-tailored rules out there and sit down and draft your own. And I am a big advocate of that process if you're willing to spend the time. You can adopt another government's rules of order. Again, they're usually uniform and can be used by various governments, or you can go to something like Bob's Rules of Order. And let me talk about Bob's Rules of Order, because that's why I'm here, I hope. This is, and again, I put at the top of this slide, it's not a shameless plug. I drafted this book over the course of maybe 15 years because of all the experience I sat in government and watching things that frustrated me and frustrated governing body members. I'm not selling this book. It's not a book that I did for sale. It's a book that I did because I love what I've done for 35 years. So it's out there. It's with CML. They're distributing it. If they sell it, they can sell it, but I'm not selling the book. I've attended, and this number is probably very low, 1,600 public meetings in 35 years. It's a slew of meetings in which I sat there frustrated, not only because I can't watch Monday Night Football many times, but because of the problems that government created for itself by not having rules and not following rules. So I drafted this book to basically be a coalescence of the good stuff out there that governing bodies have done to make their meetings efficient. And I'm hopeful that the book is easy enough and basic enough that people will look at it, read it, understand it once through, and be able to conduct their work after that. The word amendable is on this slide for a reason. Bob's Rules of Order can be amended before you adopt it. There's nothing in the book that says if you adopt Bob's Rules of Order, we're going to go through the rules, that you adopt Bob's Rules of Order, that you must follow every single rule. You have the flexibility of amending them before you adopt them, much like you do to the Uniform Building Code or International Building Code. You take pieces out of it and you change it before you adopt it. Same thing here with Bob's Rules of Order. The rules completely conform with Colorado law, so that we know that when we follow the rules, we're doing what state law says, and it addresses quasi-judicial procedures and what we're supposed to do. When you read the book, you find out that it meshes with quasi-judicial practices, and it tells you where there's a special rule that has to be followed or followed differently because you're engaged in a quasi-judicial obligation or requirement. What we're going to walk through from now on is in the book, the terminology that's used in the book. Much of the book is just how to adopt, how to do this. It's not really the rules themselves. So although it may look like 220 pages, it's actually far less. But we're going to talk about terminology because it's important. What you say and how you follow, what you say and how you follow the rules is determined by how you see the words play out that you're using. We're going to talk about special rules that you need to use the right way to follow the rules. We're going to talk about the rules themselves as quickly as I can. We're going to talk about the points, which are special kinds of rules that we have to follow, and we're going to summarize with some of the motions that you commonly will be using if you follow Bob's rules. In Bob's rules, if you want to kind of make it easy for yourself in understanding it, there are two appendices in the back. One is C and one is B. What they are is they're summaries of what you will find in the book. If you read through these appendices, you will get almost all of it, of what you need. You don't necessarily have to read the entire book if you read these two appendices. If you read a rule under Appendix B and you say, I don't understand why we would do that, go back in the book and read the commentary, and it tells you why the rule is set up the way it's set up. But that's the easy way to go through this. And so within 6 or 7 pages, you can understand what the rules provide. Starting with the terminology, Bob's Rules of Order breaks down certain terminology that we have to understand. Much of the terminology is pretty understandable today. If you read things in there like floor, you know what the floor is, having the floor to speak. You don't need to be taught what that is. But there are some words that you do need to understand how they are different, how they're defined in order to follow the rules. The issues, or the words discussion and debate, are used very specifically for a very specific reason in the rules. We as government, and this is not true in Robert's Rules of Order, we in government discuss things before we oftentimes have a motion, and then we debate the motion. The motion is a proposition. I suggest that we do the following. What do you think? But we always, oftentimes in government, discuss things before a motion is available to us. And then once the motion is made, we debate it. So discussion and debate are used in the context of each side of the motion. I did this because Robert's Rules of Order requires that you have a motion before you do anything. You cannot discuss a topic unless you have a motion on the floor. I'm going to talk about why that's a bad idea later on, but that's what's required. So we want to get away from that and allow government to do what government does, which is discuss things before the motion is proposed, which is very efficient if you think about it. If you can talk about what it is you want to do before you throw out the idea of making a motion, that's the most efficient way to conduct business. We have the word debatable motion used in the rules. These are the set of motions that once made and once seconded that you're allowed to talk about. Some are not debatable. We'll touch upon that. And the issue of objection is used in the rules. When it refers to an objection, what it means is that one of you can make an objection to what somebody's proposing to do, and you can stop it. And we'll discuss that, the use of that. Continue and postpone is also used in the rules, and they're used this way. They really mean two different things. They're two different words if you break down the real definition. But in government, we have traditionally used those two words to mean the same thing. So if I say I move to continue, or I move to postpone, under Bob's Rules of Order, it means the same thing. Whatever it is we're doing, we're putting it off, okay? And so I'm not going to parse the words so finely that it's confusing. I'm going to stop here and let you know that the rules are the product of not only my time that I've spent doing all this stuff, but I had a little panel of 7 experts on procedural rules in the state of Colorado who are attorneys that I've known for most of my career who've worked with me in getting these rules polished, if you will. There's some of the rules in there that I may not have agreed with until I was convinced it's a good thing to have, and I'll touch upon those. But this is a product of a lot of people going through what works for government. Yes.
2 questions. In our packet, there's a picture of a golden retriever. What's that dog's name?
I do not know because it's not my dog, unfortunately.
Okay. And the second is kind of a question over this way. Do we have a ruling about non-abstention? If we are present and able, we are to vote. We do not abstain from voting.
The charter does not allow abstentions. If you're present, you have to vote on an item before you unless there's the legal impediment which requires recusal. I think, Bob, we've talked about that.
That's absolutely right, yeah. That's what your rules provide, and you'll find out that I will tell you that's the sane way to conduct government in a moment. We'll get to that rule. Lastly, the terminology abstain and recuse are used in the book. You don't necessarily have to pay attention to that because you don't allow for abstentions under your current rules. So you don't really need to understand the difference between these two. But basically, to abstain means that I'm not going to vote, even though I have no legal reason why I can't. So I can participate in the discussion, I can participate in the debate, I can even make a motion, but I'm not going to vote. That's abstaining. Recusing is that I have a legal impediment. I have to get out of the procedure, the process, and I cannot participate and I cannot vote by law. That's to recuse yourself. And so you see that used in the book, the 2 different words, but recuse is the one that you need to pay attention to. If you cannot vote and you cannot participate because of, say, a conflict of interest, you need to recuse yourself, not abstain.
I would note, just as an aside that's important for all of this, is that our boards and commissions do not have that prohibition. So if you're on the HPC, you can abstain. And often the abstention is based on the fact that you've come into a second reading and you're not familiar, you haven't had a chance to review the record. It's appropriate to abstain. So when we adopt these, that it will apply to those boards and commissions, and we need the abstention provision.
No, I don't believe it will. It will require secondary action by the council. To clarify, council's adoption of rules of orders through its city council rules and regulations, council's asked us to develop a secondary accountability process for board and commissions, which you may choose or not choose to use these procedures for.
Well, that's a good point, but I will tell you that our boards and commissions have also, I think on their own provisions, have adopted the Robert's rules and probably would suggest them. Yeah, you're right.
We're also going to touch upon real quickly a terminology, because I'm going to use this when we talk about the rules, the point of order. There's 3 points in the book. We'll get to those in a moment. But the one that you need to know about right up front is that there's something called a point of order. You may already use this. I don't know. But a point of order basically says that you want to alert the chairperson, the mayor, and the rest of the council to the fact that we're not following our rules. So you'll make a point of order. So when I say that's subject to a point of order, it means it's subject to somebody raising the point that you're not following the rules. That's why I bring that in here. So let's talk about the rules. And I'm going to go relatively quickly and then stall out, if you will, on some of that are most important and the ones that you may want to think about before you would think about adopting Bob's Rules of Order. They're set up this way. The rules are set from the general rules that govern our meetings all the way down to how we suspend and deviate the rules. And in between there is the process of our meetings, how we determine quorum, what the presiding officer is supposed to do, how do we get the floor, how do we make motions and second them. There's something called friendly requests we'll talk about, and how do we vote. And so it's set up kind of somewhat linear to the way in which meetings are conducted. So the general rules roll out this way. Most of them, I hope you say, when I tell you here's the rule, you'll say, yeah, of course we're going to do that. Some of them you say, why is that rule there? We'll talk about those. So the rule number one, run one, is that all of the state laws and all the local laws that are out there in the ether, if you will, are rules that apply to our meetings, okay? Our rules of order are going to be followed, but we're also going to follow all the laws, the state law and our local laws in conducting our meeting. We do this is mostly for lawyers out there, because we like to not have to have people say whether or not we have to admit into evidence or admit into the hearing the fact that this law exists in order to follow it. No, it's all part of our meeting process. Rule 1.2 is that we're going to follow the agenda. You know this. This is a duh rule. Of course we're going to do that. But we also oftentimes amend our agenda by motion oftentimes, but we're going to follow our meeting agenda. We have that so that the chairperson, the mayor, doesn't get a chance to skip around as he or she deems appropriate. You get to hold the mayor to follow the agenda unless it's formally changed by the body. That's why that rule's here. Rule 1.3 is that we get to assume that the notice required for our meeting and our notice that's required for the matter that we're considering was done. And this is a rule that is out there mostly for communities that go through the painstaking process of saying, before we conduct this meeting or before we have the hearing, let's have the staff summarize the notice that they put out there. You don't need to do that. Under Bob's Rules of Order, we're going to assume that the notice was provided, and if you question whether or not a presumption is appropriate, you can read the commentary and understand that we follow the rules for notice. Your staff is very attuned to doing notice correctly, and rarely is notice incorrect. So we're going to presume that that's the case under the rules. Rule 1.4 is that if you have a conflict of interest, you must recuse yourself, okay? Both from participating and from voting. This is state law, but oftentimes communities say, you got to force me to get out. I may have a conflict of interest, but I'm not leaving. I'm staying in the game. This rule says you got to get out. And that's what state law says. And the rule's there because there are sometimes that council members and board members out there have said, I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay in the game. And all they do is mess up our process because they create an issue that could be appealed with regard to the decision that we're making because they had a conflict and they shouldn't be sitting there. This rule just solidifies their obligation to do so. If they didn't, they'd be out of order. They must get out. Rule 1.5 is that we do not need a motion to discuss something. This is a contrary rule to Robert's Rules of Order. This allows us to do what we normally do, which is talk about stuff before we have a motion. Rule 1.5 is also important in this context. And this is something I've been banging a drum on across the state, and I want to make sure that we all pay attention to it because it's come up. And that is the fact that under Robert's Rules especially, or anytime we do this practice in a quasi-judicial situation, that we make a motion too early. In other words, we haven't heard the evidence, it's not there before us, but somebody says, I move to approve. What that says to the public is we've already decided this matter. We've already decided that we're going to approve it. So what Bob's Rules allows you to do is to hold off on making that motion until you get all the evidence before you, and then you make the motion. But surprise, surprise, this is what we do anyway. But Robert's Rules requires us to have a motion before we start taking the evidence. So under Robert's Rules of Order, if you have an applicant before you for a quasi-judicial matter, before they open their mouth and before you take any evidence, you got to have a motion. And that motion is going to be what? I move to approve. What's the public going to think about that? They're going to think, why are they moving to approve already? This is all greased. This is all preordained. And so we get away from that view by the public by making sure that we can hold off on our motion until later. Rule 1.6 is what I call a lawyer's rule. What this says is that when we have a meeting, that everything that we talked about, everything that we debated, all the laws that are available are all bases for our decision. We don't have to call out any particular law in order to use it. This happens in some communities when they say, before we start the hearing, let's go ahead and make sure that we understand that we have adopted the comprehensive plan. We have to make that statement, otherwise we can't use it. That's not the way government should operate. Government should assume that all the laws that we have apply to us regardless. That's all this rule does. It helps lawyers mostly. We also have this inference or presumption that our decision is drawn from the record that we have. This is an important rule for the following reason. You oftentimes get a staff report, or you perhaps might have a Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation that says you should approve something. Well, if you decide not to approve it, then where's the evidence that we have? We have a staff report that says yes. We have a recommendation from the P&Z that says yes, but we're going to say no. This allows the lawyer to look into the record and pull out the things that support the no, as opposed to having to have you express to the public and express on the floor why you're going to vote against the recommendation of staff or the P&Z. This is a rule mostly for lawyers. We get to go into the record and find the stuff that's going to help us. Rule 1.8 is with regard to adjourning the meeting. Many communities do a formal motion to adjourn. I do not know about your practice. Maybe you do that. But in many communities, they don't want to do that. They just want to say, are we done here? We're done here. Unless I see an objection, we're going to go home. That's enough under this rule. It does not mean you do not have to have, don't have to have a motion to adjourn. You can if you want to, but in those communities that are going to adopt the rules, who want to follow a more casual practice, which is not, you'd be surprised how many do this, they just want to have the mayor say, we're done here, let's go home. And there's no need for a formal adjournment. With regard to the quorum, most of this is going to be provided by your bylaws. Your bylaws should say, for our meetings, here's the quorum requirement. If we're going to have a regular meeting or a special meeting, the quorum is oftentimes a majority of a governing body. But some communities have a quorum in their bylaw requirements for workshops or work sessions or study sessions that's less than a majority, so that less than the entire group can get together and talk about something. They believe that's an appropriate quorum to have a lower quorum level because they're not going to be making a decision. All they're going to be doing is taking information. But the bylaws provide for what their quorum requirement is going to be. The rules of order tell us how to count the noses to make sure that we have a quorum. The general rule for quorum is going to be that we have to have the quorum that's required in order to conduct business. That's a no-brainer rule. We're always going to do that. That's just the way it's going to be. Rule 2.2 is that quorum is going to be, unless our bylaws say otherwise, the quorum is going to be this. It's going to be a majority of our governing body. You have 5, so it's going to be 3. And it's got to be those people who are present and eligible to vote. So if you're here, but you have a conflict of interest, you can't be counted for the quorum. You're not part of the quorum. That's what this rule says. Or if you're not here, and what I mean by here is that you're not physically here if it's an in-person meeting, or you're not participating if it's a remote meeting in the way that you're allowed to participate in remoteness. So you have to be present in the context of what you decide to be present in your community. But if you've got a conflict of interest or you're not physically here, you don't count for a quorum. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. I hope you go back and refer. It's just basically the idea that if everybody's here, you got the quorum. If you got everybody here, you got everybody but one person here and one person's conflicted, you have 3 for your 5 group, you got a quorum. But if you got 2 people absent and one person conflicted, you don't have a quorum and you can't conduct business. It's pretty much the way it should work, and it does work across the country with regard to local government. And the quorum is a continuing requirement under the rules. It means that you start the meeting with a quorum, and every time you have an agenda item, especially for quasi-judicial matters, you got to look around the room and make sure everybody's there, they're present, and make sure they're not conflicted out. Otherwise, you have to determine that you cannot go forward because you don't have the necessary quorum. That's what this rule is all about. Rule 2.3 is a rule that was requested by some communities that have this problem, and I hope you don't have this problem. This problem is this. When you have a motion on the floor, somebody says, Mayor, I'd like to be excused. Somebody's made a motion, it's seconded, you're debating it, and somebody says, Mayor, I'd like to be excused. Are you going to let that person leave? Well, here's how the rule works out. If they have a conflict of interest, and that's why they're leaving, the mayor's going to let them out right then. if they ask to get out of the meeting because they have an excuse, say they have an emergency at home, if they're not going to deny you the quorum, you still can carry on the motion, you're going to boot them out right then. But if they're going to upset the quorum, you're not going to count them as being out of the room until such time that you've decided the motion. Why is that? Some communities have this problem, and I hope you don't, that somebody will be sitting there in the meeting, they realize they're against the motion. They don't want the motion, but they think the motion is going to pass, and they realize if I get up and leave, if I get excused and I'm out of here, the motion will fail. Believe it or not, there are communities that have this problem. I hope you don't. It's an underhanded way to try to get a decision made by a single individual. So this rule's there to address that problem. If the person's going to deny you the quorum, you do not have to let them out of the room until the motion's decided. If they leave anyway, they're going to be unexcused, which is the next rule. Members' unexcused absence, while the motion's on the floor, doesn't affect the quorum. So somebody gets up and walks out, and let's say the quorum's going to be upset because of that walkout, doesn't matter. They're still physically sitting there, even though the chair is vacant. They're going to be a no vote, but they're still there so we can make a decision. So if 4 of you are going to vote yes, and this person walks out, it's a 4-1 vote. They're going to count them as having still been here. And we do that to protect the quorum, because sometimes they may walk out to defeat the quorum. And if they do that, you go ahead and vote. You go ahead and vote. And they'll be listed as having not voted or voting no. Okay, so we have to have this rule because the requirement is under quorum that you must have a majority, you must have the quorum in order to conduct business. Well, what happens if we don't have a quorum? We still have to conduct one piece of business, and that is, what are we going to do with the fact that we don't have a quorum? You got the public here, you made the advertisements, you did the notice. What are we going to do? This rule allows you to both to postpone the meeting or postpone an agenda item if that's the case. Straight up, it allows you to act even though you don't have a quorum. Now, you do this, because I know you do this, because you have a good city attorney, but you never, ever, ever postpone a quasi-judicial matter unless you are very clear about when you're going to come back, time, place, and date, okay? So the public who's here because you gave them notice, they know when to come back. If you don't do that, you have to republish your notice and start completely over. Most communities like to make sure that they can just set a new date and they don't have to worry about notice. The presiding officer, this is the mayor. What does the mayor have to do? What's the rules for the mayor? We put these rules in here because we have to tell the mayor what they're supposed to do. Because too many times, mayors either end up ineffective because they don't take the reins, or they become too forceful in their activities to deny people the opportunity to participate. That's not going to be your case, but it does happen out there in government.
Question for you.
Yes, Mayor.
Thanks. Just before you,
sorry.
was that for me? Oh, okay, good. On quorum, before you get too far into this presiding officer discussion, it's never happened in my time on council, but given how small of a town we are, I imagine it has happened before or will happen in the future, is what if a majority are conflicted on something? Do your rules handle that, or is it silent on that?
State law addresses that.
Okay.
The state law provision allows you to participate even with a conflict of interest if you do certain disclosures to the Secretary of State, and that they have that rule so that you can conduct business even with a quorum. So it covers you in state law. Very rarely used, but it does happen.
Jim and I have talked about it before, but I didn't know if it was procedural or legislative, or
It's often referred to as the rule of necessity. It did happen one time when we had 4 people declare a conflict. So you don't try to weigh the substance of the conflict. Everybody just comes on.
And the Secretary of State requires you to fill out an online form identifying the conflict, and it's basically for transparency. It says, I have to stay in here and vote, otherwise we can't do business, and I want the public to know why I'm conflicted out. It's fairness. It's fairness, it's transparency.
thanks.
Jim, do you mind if I ask, what was that instance?
It was over the Aspen Club. We had the attorney for the Aspen Club, former attorney for the Aspen Club on the board, 2 people who had family members working for the Aspen Club, and 1 person who just had a personal relationship with the president. Yeah, that's 4.
That actually makes perfect sense. I have a membership at the club.
Adam Frisch was the only person he wanted to vote, and just controlled it all.
Interesting.
And there are some, with regard to small communities, conflicts are inevitable, right? You know everybody, okay? And so those kinds of conflicts where I know the applicant, I know the people in the room, there's easy ways to get around that, okay, by disclosures that you might make on the record, but the easiest way is through the state law. But you can work around that, but that's just, it happens all the time in small communities. So with regard to the mayor, the presiding officer, that's the person who's going to run the meeting. The rules say he or she has the right to run the meeting. Why do we need this? So nobody else can do it, okay? Because here's what might happen. Let's say a majority of the board or the city council decides we don't want the mayor to run meetings. So we're going to vote the mayor off the island. Well, without this rule, they can, okay? And that would not fly in most communities because the mayor is elected by the population to run the meetings. They understand the mayor is the meeting runner, and that's what this rule says. So this is a rule that can be changed before you would adopt Bob's rules. And some communities have changed it because they feel differently. And that is that the presiding officer is the person that's declared to be the parliamentarian. This is the person that makes judgments on whether we're following the rules and says yes or no. They're the ones who know the rules best. They already have the floor because they're running the meeting. So the rule says that the mayor is going to be the parliamentarian unless you assign that role to someone else. The reason why that clause is in there is because a number of communities have a separate person who acts as parliamentarian. In fact, some of the largest communities have a person who's hired to be the parliamentarian, like in Denver. Okay, so that allows Denver to use these rules because they have to assign it to another person. If you read the commentary in this rule, in the book, you find out that sometimes it's a problem under the rules to assign that parliamentarian role, and I don't know if you do that here, to either the attorney or to the clerk. The problem with that, as I've experienced, is that if the attorney or the clerk's the one that's calling out somebody of not being in order on the rules, that's an uncomfortable position to be in, is to be the judge over the people that basically may hire or fire you. So we try to shy away from the idea of assigning the parliamentarian role to somebody who's a subordinate to the council. Okay, so we make the mayor the parliamentarian, and you can figure out somebody else if you want to do that role, but the rules start there. Rule 3.3 is that the mayor has the same rights as everybody else. This is true generally for most governments, okay? There are some state law provisions that do not apply to you that give the mayor less power if decided by the governing body. But for the mayor can make motions, second motions, discuss and participate to the same degree everybody else can. And this is actually addresses the Robert's Rules of Order issue, but the mayor has to remain quiet. You know, this is to allow the mayor to speak as our governments in Colorado allow the mayor to do. Now, the mayor is also, because they're the person who runs the meetings, has an ability to have some discretion. This happens, let's say there's no rules. This happens generally in government anyway, because the mayor is deciding where we're going to go, and the mayor makes decisions, and we all say, that's great. And we follow the mayor. We let the mayor lead us. This rule gives us a rule to let the mayor lead us. It says the mayor can decide which direction to go unless there's a point of order or a point of appeal. So if you, for example, the mayor says, I'm going to let everybody speak for more than 5 minutes tonight on the subject because the rules may limit you. We'll talk about that next. The mayor can do it. And unless you object to it or raise a point of order, the mayor can do it. So this gives the mayor the ability to run the meeting as the mayor sees fit, unless somebody wants to force compliance with the rules. It happens this way anyway. And that the presiding officer, the mayor, is supposed to be this neutral and fair administrator of our process. The mayor is not supposed to be somebody who sits here and says, I'm telling you what we're going to do it my way. That's not a good mayor. And anybody who reads the material on effective leadership in the position of chair or mayor is going to learn quickly that the best people to run meetings are going to be people who leave the others in the dais to make to direct the process, to let the mayor put out the fertile ground for these people to make the decision, and to basically take somewhat of a back seat, okay, and let them make the motion, perhaps second the motion, and lead discussion. It doesn't mean the mayor can't make a motion or can't do a second, because sometimes the mayor may look around and say, do I have a motion, and nobody says anything. The mayor's completely at liberty to make a motion. Sometimes the proposition that you're discussing is the mayor's proposition. The mayor says, I think we need to do this. So the mayor can take the seat of saying, I'm going to make the motion. It was my idea. Not a problem. But generally, this rule says the mayor's going to defer to the other members to basically conduct the business of the body, letting the mayor chime in when the mayor wants to chime in or should chime in. This also helps the situation where the body, generally a majority of the body, feels the mayor is being too strong. This is a rule that can be used to let the mayor know to chill a little bit. So with regard to the floor, we all know what the floor is. The floor is our opportunity to speak, right? And we want to make sure we protect the floor and we have rules for the floor. Otherwise, we have largely a bunch of people yelling at each other. So we have to have the floor in order to address the body. The mayor will recognize you and allow, or anybody else, to allow them to have exclusive use of the floor to discuss the matter. That's what the floor is, and the mayor has that role to play out under the presiding officer rules. Now, the mayor is obligated to call upon you in accordance with the practices that you have before you. Some communities use a machine that you push a button and it puts you in a queue. Okay? The mayor can't skip you, is what this rule says, okay? So this rule is needed because absent a rule, the mayor could skip you. And so this rule is needed in order to tell the mayor to follow the process that we have, whether it's show of hands, whether it's voice requests, whatever you use in your practice is what the mayor is supposed to follow. That way they can't skip you. The mayor can't skip you. That's this rule. And Rule 4.3 is that you're only going to speak for 5 minutes. Now let's take a deep breath on that, because some communities I presented to say, that'll never work for us, and that's fine. But generally, this is true. Generally, in most government, when somebody speaks for more than 5 minutes, they become repetitious, or they're just killing us, right? They've already made their point. 5 minutes is a long period of time to speak, you will find out, if you really time it. And so the rules say you're only going to speak for 5 minutes when you're speaking, when you have the floor. Get to whether or not you can speak again in a moment. So 5 minutes is the rule. However, because the mayor has the discretion to deviate from the rules, as does the body, you have the ability to decide, we're not going to follow 5 minutes. For this particular item, everybody can speak for 10, or there is no limit. You can do that. The mayor could do the following. Let's say you have a very contentious land use matter, and you know that the governing body members are going to want to speak for more than 5 minutes. The mayor has the power to do this under the discretion that he has in the previous rule we talked about. The mayor can say, this is a contentious item. I think we're all going to want to speak for more than 5 minutes. I'm going to set the minutes at the minute level at 10. Has the discretion to do that. And unless there's an objection, and somebody says, nope, our rules say 5, you're going to do 10. If somebody says, no, I object, we're going to follow our rules, then a motion to waive this rule, suspend this rule, would be in order. So you can make it 10 by the body. But the mayor generally is going to be followed, because the mayor usually knows what's going on in the meeting. Now, with regard to speaking again, the rule is this. I got my 5 minutes, I spoke. Okay? Now, everyone else gets an opportunity to speak before I speak again. Doesn't mean they have to speak. It means they have an opportunity. So here's how it works. You spoke 5 minutes. You're happy. You want to speak again. We want 5 more minutes. You got more to say. So you want to get in the queue and get recognized. The mayor's going to look around the room and make sure everybody else has had an opportunity. And oftentimes the mayor will say this: is there anyone else who wishes to speak before we go back to Councilmember Smith? And no one wants to speak? Smith gets the floor. That's the way it really should work in real life, and that's the way it should always work with Bob's Rules of Order. We'll ask for everybody to get an opportunity. Doesn't mean everybody's going to have to speak. There is no, by the way, ultimate limit as to how many times people can speak. That's up to you to police. So if it's somebody does 5 and other people do 5 and 5 and 5 and we're speaking all night long, that's fine. We have a motion to close debate that you could use, but for the most part, we have no limit to how many times you can gain the floor. With regard to motion, this gets into the practice of how we're going to make our decision. A lot of this is fairness, okay? We have to have a motion to take formal action. You already know that. That rule's in there. That way we can't later on say, well, we all kind of said that we were going to do this. No, it has to be a motion. Otherwise, we're not making a decision to take formal action. That's what this rule says. Nobody can imply from the record that we decided something unless a motion was actually voted upon. There is something called the so moved motion. Mayor, do you do this here? So moved? We do. So Bob's Rules of Order has adopted this practice that many governments across Colorado do, but not all. And that's the idea that if you have a clearly understood motion, somebody says something and we all know exactly what the motion is, somebody can say so moved. Okay? It requires a second, and if that works out and nobody objects, in other words, nobody says, objection, I want a formal motion. If nobody objects, you can use the so moved motion to go forward. Most oftentimes, it will be like this. Let's say the finance director gives you a report and requests that you approve the report. Everybody knows exactly what the motion is to approve the report. That's it. So moved. Second. Go forward. Nobody objected. You make a decision. That's all this is. It allows us to be more efficient and not have a formally moved motion. Okay? The motion that's made has to be, and this is an important thing to have because people struggle with this, is it has to have three characteristics. It has to be an affirmative proposition. It has to be understandable. Everybody knows what we're going to be doing, and we're going to vote. It has to be in a format that can be a yes or no. It wouldn't be, I move to have us decide how much money to raise the salary of the city manager. That's not a yes or no question. Okay? So that would be a motion that's out of order. It must be understandable, a yes or no question, an affirmative proposition. The affirmative proposition means it's going to change the status quo. We do this for a reason. Right now, if you do not make a decision, the status quo stays the same. You do not need a motion that says, I want us to continue to do what we're doing. That's a waste of our time. So it must be something that's going to change the status quo. I move to do the following, to change what we're doing. That has to be an element of the motion. Everybody needs to understand it. If they don't, you're going to be wasting everybody's time, and a yes or no response. And here's the kicker. It requires a second. We all know that. We practice this across the board. But in order for that motion that's made, that met those three requirements to be, it has an affirmative motion, a yes or no question, and is understood. In order for that to be on the floor for us to make a decision, the mayor has to acknowledge that motion as proper. Okay? So this is just a stopgap here. It allows us to have somebody say, I think we need to talk about it because I'm not really sure how clear the motion is. It's not automatically on the floor when the second is made. Too many times governments have said, no, we've got to vote on it. We had a second. Well, we didn't have an adequate motion, and it's only adequate, it's only decided to be on the floor when the mayor says it's on the floor. So this rule allows the mayor the right to place it on the floor because it meets those three requirements. So once it's acknowledged by the mayor, it's owned by the body. The reason we do this is so that nobody can take it off the floor without the body's approval. This happens too often in government where somebody will make a motion, it gets a second, it's on the floor, they're debating it. 20 minutes into debate, the person who made the motion goes, I'm going to withdraw my motion. It was my motion. It's off the floor. So although we wasted 20 minutes of everybody's time, that person claimed ownership of the motion and took it off the floor. That is not possible under Bob's rules. Once the mayor says it's on the floor, that it met the requirements of an adequate motion, it's owned by all of you. It cannot be taken from the floor unless a majority of you agree. So it's a way in which we solidify this motion as being owned by you and not by the individual who made it. Too many times the individual removes it because they don't like the discussion that's going on, or they sense it's going to go down in flames. So I want to take it away. This prevents that. The body gets to determine what happens with the motion. The presiding officer, under the rules, is required to do the following. If you made the motion and you seconded, the mayor turns to you and says you have the first right to speak to your motion. It's your motion in the sense of you were the one who proposed it. It's on the floor. You get the first right to speak. Doesn't mean you have to. It means you can say, no, Mayor, I think I'm good. But you can also say, thank you, Mayor, and you can say, here's why I proposed the motion. It helps us in an efficiency standpoint understand where this person who threw the motion out there wants to go and what the parameters of the motion are. So this is an important rule to make sure for efficiency that we're going to understand what the intent was of the motion because that person gets to speak first. There are two items in the Bob's rules or friendly requests. These are done by a couple of communities across the state, and it was requested by the panel to say this is probably a good practice, and so it's in here. We have two things that are called friendly requests. Do you do friendlies here? Friendly, somebody says, I'd like to make a friendly amendment? You do. Okay. We've solidified that in the rules, and it works this way. We have an amendment to a motion, or we have a withdrawal of motion. These are the two situations in which we allow a friendly request to be made and not a formal motion. So I don't have to say, I formally move to amend the motion, because I can go use a friendly request. It's an easy way, efficient way to do something that we all understand what we want to do. So the friendly amendment works this way. It has to be a debatable motion. These are motions that are like a principal motion or a main motion where you're going to say, I want to do something. It's debatable. We're going to talk about it. If it's debatable and we're going to talk about it, somebody can do the following. I'd propose a friendly amendment to, for example, change a number in the motion. If somebody says, I want to buy 7 new laptops for the governing body, 5 new laptops, somebody can say, I'd like a friendly amendment to change it to 6, so we have a backup. Everybody understands this. It's pretty simple. Everybody goes, cool, let's just do it. We don't need a formal motion, a second, and a debate, and a vote. We just can offer it up as a friendly amendment. That friendly amendment can be put out there. Same thing with withdrawing. If we all know this motion has no legs, it's not going to go anywhere, somebody can say, I'd like to offer a friendly amendment to withdraw the motion. We're not going to vote on this thing. It's a waste of time. When those things happen, we can move on them without formal process because everybody's going to be down with it. They're going to be okay with it. So one member of the public, one member of the governing body can object. You can say, nope, I want to force us to go to a formal motion. If one person says that, you can't use the friendly situation. But if no one objects, you can use it. It's very efficient to do so, and that's how it almost always works out.
Just to let you know, when we've done, the way we've handled friendly amendments is it requires the seconder to approve the friendly amendment, and then it'll proceed. Somebody would always have a right to either vote against the motion and defeat it or make a separate motion to amend.
If that's the practice and you want to continue it, then you would need to make a small tweak to the Bob's rules before you adopt it. Because the way it would work is this. If you say, I want to make a friendly amendment to change the number from 6 to 7, you make that to the mayor. The mayor goes, okay, we have a request for a friendly amendment to change it from 6 to 7. Do I hear any objections? Hearing no objection, the amendment's approved. There's no need for a second under Bob's rules because we all agree. So why go to somebody and say, do you agree? No, we all agree. We don't need a second. And so there's no second under friendlies needed.
But under our practice is that the person who turned it off. The person who seconded the motion, the original motion, if it's okay with the seconder, then it's accepted as an amendment to the motion.
The difference, though, is now the body has accepted the motion as a whole, so now the body must ask as a whole.
Well, his is different.
Yeah, mine's different.
So definitely, I recognize that. I just wanted council to understand our.
So in that situation, we could have somebody say, I would like to change the number from 6 to 2nd. The mayor goes, do we have a second? We have a second. Okay, it's done. Well, there's 3 members who say, I don't want to do it.
No, I'm not saying it that way. Person makes a motion to approve 5. I move to approve 5. So, somebody seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else throws out, well, let's do 6. And the person who made the motion says, okay, I'll amend my motion to 6. If the seconder accepts that amendment, then it's done as, just the 2 of
No,
them.
I know, but then you have 3 people who are backing the
Well,
change.
sort of. I
Right,
mean,
right.
somebody
So
else.
that makes sense in a group of 5. For Aspen, that would work. For a group of 7,
Yeah,
there
it's
could be
still
a
a little
majority of people who still don't want the amendment.
Yeah.
So that's why this rule's there.
It's a little different. We would have to discuss whether we wanted to.
Yeah, you and Gunnison and a few other communities who have 5 governing body members have a different twist on that because that would work the way you've done it. So with regard to the vote, here's how voting works. Okay, once the presiding officer, once the mayor says, I'm going to call for the vote, that's a practice I suspect you do because everybody does it. So the mayor's done. We've drained the debate. Everybody's done. We're ready to go. Mayor says, I'm going to call for the vote. When the call for the vote's made, it closes the floor. Nobody else gets to speak. Okay, keeps people from chiming in before the vote comes up. You cannot assign by proxy or absentee your right to vote. You can't do it, and that's just generally a good rule, and it's in the book. Okay,
reasoning
so
for that one, please?
okay, so proxy is this. You're not going to be at the
I
meeting.
know what it is. I
Okay,
want
so
to understand the reasoning, please.
understand the reason for it. It's a case of, one, transparency, so that people stand behind what they're going to do, okay? Because if they give you the right to vote, if they give you the right to vote and you vote for them, they could later on say, that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So they represent to the public that I was misrepresented. That's not fair. If you want to be represented, you be here, you vote, right? The other possibility is that we don't like this practice is because who's to say what the ultimate motion's going to be? So I give you my right to vote for me, for what? To approve the contract? Did I give you the right to approve the contract subject to a bunch of conditions, which is what the motion said? I would never have approved that, but you voted on behalf of me because I gave you my proxy. We don't allow that. You want to vote, you be here, right? You do not assign it to somebody else. There's none of that's going on. And that's been the practice. It also prevents this, what we call farming for votes. So you really feel strongly about it, so you go to some other people, and it happens on a bigger body, like 11, when the city of Lakewood has 11. So you can go out there and pick off some people, say, you're not going to be there, let me vote for you, and here's what I want to do. And you come in loaded with all these votes. We declare that to be unfair. So you can't, after the call for the vote, so the mayor says, we're going to vote, I'm going to call for the vote, we know the floor is closed. You cannot explain your vote after the call for the vote. We're asking you to say yes or no. You're not asking you to say why you want to vote the way you vote. This is a clumsy thing that happens in some governments. I hope it doesn't happen here. But there's rules to prevent this clumsiness of having this happen. All right, so the mayor closes the floor, we're going to go to the vote, and they go to you, and you say yes, and you say no, and this person says, well, let me tell you why I'm going to vote no. Here's why I'm going to vote no. I'm going to vote no because of the following. Now, they didn't even speak in debate, and now they're throwing all this stuff out on the floor of why they want to do that. And you say, that's a great idea. I want to change my vote. You should have spoke earlier. Now you did. I'm glad you did. It prevents that from happening. And by preventing that from happening, it does this. It forces you to get in on the debate. If you want to be heard, the time to be heard is when we can talk to each other, not when you're going to be everyone else doesn't have the floor. Now I get to throw out what I want to throw out, and I don't get challenged on it. So this rule allows you, or allows us to say, you got to make a yes or no. You missed your chance to say why you're going to say yes or no. That was during debate. Okay? Robert's Rules of Order requires the person who makes the motion and the person who seconded it to vote in favor of the motion. So you made a motion, you seconded it. The motion got debated, it got amended 6 times. Now you guys don't like it at all. It's not what you proposed. Robert's rule says you must vote yes. That's not right. That's not right. So Bob's rules changes that situation. It says that you don't have to vote in favor of your own motion, or if you were the second, you don't have to vote in favor of the motion. And here's what it also allows is this practice. This is a waste of our time. This is a terrible idea. It's a terrible discussion. I'm just going to throw it out there as a motion to approve so we can kill it and move on. That allows me to vote no. The reason I put the motion out there to approve is so that we can move on, and I'm going to vote no. Robert's rule says if you offer a motion to amend or motion to approve, you got to vote yes. It doesn't allow you to basically throw something out there so you can kill it and move on. Okay? This is how government works in Colorado. So again, you have to vote yes or no. This is a big issue in a lot of communities and not in Aspen because your rules require you to vote yes or no, and you don't get to abstain. That's a good practice. That's what Bob's rule says you must do, and there's a very big discussion in the book about why it's a good idea not to allow abstentions. I won't go into it because you don't do it. But in a lot of other communities, they've changed this rule. They've adopted Bob's rules, but they've changed the rule to say we do allow abstentions. That's okay. They understand that it may not be good practice, but they did it. But you got to vote yes or no. If you don't vote yes or no, according to the rules, then your vote is recorded as failed to vote. So you got to stand before the citizens who elected you and say, yeah, 16 times I refuse to vote because I refuse to say yes or no. All right, that's on you. But you do have to say yes or no. Otherwise, it's counted as did not vote.
Mr. Mayor, I'm just going to jump in on that one real quick also, just to advise the council, the charter is very specific about this and about what are the, about the requirement to vote. What is the ability for recusal, and if there's a refusal, if there's a refusal to vote without meeting the recusal requirements, it is stated in the charter that you're guilty of misconduct of office. So the community took it really seriously about that. You have to make those tough choices when they come up. So it's just something important to be aware of as you're going through your decision-making.
And I would say that's a very good policy to have. It should be in the bylaws. And here you've got charter, probably. But it's at least in the bylaws, it should be. And that's a very good practice to have. Some communities say that if you refuse to vote, your vote's counted as a yes or counted as a no. That runs into some First Amendment issues, and there's some history, dating back to English common law on whether or not you have the power to declare a non-vote to be a yes or a no and force that person to speak. In other words, you didn't vote, you sat there quiet. But we're going to say your vote was actually no. We're going to put words in your mouth. Under the First Amendment, there are some case law that says that's not really appropriate. So if you're not going to move your mouth, you're not going to say yes or no, we're going to say you did not vote, and you may be in trouble with your local laws too. It's a good practice. I like it. Okay. In order for us to approve a motion, we have to have you know this. You have to have a majority vote, unless a higher vote's required. There's some things that are 2/3, some things that are 3/4, like an emergency ordinance. But you have to have what's required by law in order for you to approve it. Just a rule. Now, once we get that approval, then the proposition that was offered up is decided. It's done. Somebody said, I move to approve. You had enough votes. It was approved. We're done. It's approved. Okay? But the contrary of that, the converse of that, if we fail to get enough votes, it doesn't mean, for example, if it was a motion to approve, if it failed, it doesn't mean the project was denied. What it means is the proposition failed. We still have the opportunity to go forward. Why is that important? This is why this rule's here. If somebody moves to approve and it fails, we don't get enough votes, somebody still has the opportunity to say, I move to approve subject to the following conditions. And everybody goes, that's a great idea. I like that, and we approve that. If you take the position that the mere failure of a motion to approve, for example, means that the item is dead, it cannot come back, that's not the best practice, and that's not how government operates. If it's a failure of a motion, all it means is the proposition that was offered was not advanced. It doesn't mean that the matter is decisively made. Here's how it plays out in real life, especially in land use. This happens a lot. Somebody moves to approve. The project fails to gain enough votes. Somebody offers up a motion to approve subject to conditions. It fails also. It's pretty clear that the body doesn't like this project, but we haven't had a decisive answer yet because we've been failing at propositions. So what somebody would do is say, I move to deny, and that would carry. And now you've made a decisive decision. You have a majority vote on a proposition, decided. So until you have that majority vote on a proposition, it's not decided. So you've got to keep trying. It's not uncommon in land use matters. We don't just automatically declare the matter to be dead unless we have a motion to make it dead and it passes. Yes, sir.
So a negative, let's say you have 3-2, there's a motion, there's a second, you vote on it, 3-2 against something. That's not decisive?
The best way to phrase that, you had a vote of 2-3. I moved to approve, the vote was 2 in favor, 3 against. Wasn't decided. That means the proposition failed. Okay?
So your rules say then you should then make a subsequent motion that says I move to deny this project.
And that one should pass 3-2. Now you have a majority vote decisive on the proposition that was
Pretty
offered.
different than what we do.
That's been how we've practiced it, and it's related to one of his earlier rules about actions must be in the affirmative. And we've always, and I believe our codes and charters require that to be the case. If the motion is 2, 4, and 3 against, there's something still on the table. The application is still on the table unless you continue it or move to deny it with an affirmative 3 yeses of denial. then it's considered still on the table.
Got it. Maybe we just haven't seen a denial since I've been on council.
Oh, I think we have, haven't we?
Land use, I don't know. I've never, that's news to me, so,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, maybe not, but it definitely happened in the past where, you know, and it's been confusing to some people because I have always said we need a motion to deny resolution X.
And what's really important in the questions you're raising is the following. These questions come up, and unless you have rules, you can't answer the question, right? And that's why we have rules of order. So that when you say, well, what are we going to do when we had a failure of what does that mean? And somebody would say, I don't know what it means. I mean, may or may not, I don't know. If you have a rule, you can say, here's what it means. We thought about it, here's what it means. That's why rules are important. So once you voted, so you voted yes or no, you cannot change your vote. So we go down the row, and you vote yes, no, 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 yes, whatever happens to be. You can't later on, when we're done voting, say, no, I'm going to change my vote. Okay? It's only in exceptional circumstances that you can do that. And the reason why is because there are times in which governing body members will do the following. They'll vote no, they'll watch what happens, and they'll go, wait a minute, if I change my vote, I can affect the outcome somehow. You know, they play this game. No, once you say yes or no, you felt strongly about the proposition, you've made your declaration. Your declaration isn't conditioned upon what other people think. You liked it or you didn't. It doesn't matter whether or not other people liked it or didn't, so you don't change your vote. But we do have situations that come up where somebody will say, you all know I am partially blind and I thought I pushed the wrong button. Well, the Americans with Disability Act would give them the right to change their vote. So we're going to allow exceptional circumstances to happen when individuals, for example, might have a disability and they incorrectly voted. It's going to be an exceptional circumstance, and it's up to the mayor to decide whether or not that's going to qualify.
Is it okay if I ask a question? And you may address this in the future, but we vote alphabetically.
I'm sorry?
Alphabetically.
Okay.
Councilor Doyle, Councilor Guth. Is that common practice? Do your rules address that?
It's not common practice, in my experience. It's common practice to approach voting in a manner in which it gives people kind of a fairness in the larger picture. For example, you don't always go A to Z every single time, because that forces the guy who's A to always be the leader, and sometimes it does matter what other people think. Mm-hmm. And so what most communities do is they have a system by which they start with the A and go to the Z, and the next time they start with B and go to A, and they move it, and the clerk tracks that. That's most common.
I believe there's a provision buried in Robert's rules that states the alphabetical aspect of it. And we got into a conflict with how to refer to people, and we ended up going with counselor then last name, as opposed to counselor or Mayor Tory, but counselor and then last name. And we ended up, based on what I thought was a provision buried in page 792 of the Roberts Rules, that talked about voting alphabetically.
And as I mentioned before, Robert's Rules is great for very large bodies like the state legislature. And what do they do in the state legislature? A, B, C, D, E, yeah, all the way through, every time. So same with the federal government, you know, that's how it works, right? And so it's great for that, and that's why that rule's there, is because that set of rules is written for these very large organizations.
But do your rules even address this issue?
It should be something that you put in your bylaws, because it's unique to you. It's not uniform among all communities. You can decide any method you want. Some community, I know in one community they go by wards. They have 4 different wards. And so the Ward 1 votes, the 2 members in Ward 1 vote, and then Ward 4, and then 2, and then 3. And then the next time it's 4 and 3. And so they do it that way. So everybody's different, but they do have means by which the same person isn't always the leading vote.
And the thing I would note in here is that it is implied that there will be announcement of the final vote. That is not a consistent practice of our council right now, so it may be something you want to consider.
So the last set of rules are just three, and they're basically how we add flexibility to the rules so that you all don't feel like your hands are tied with regard to the process. We call it rule suspension and deviation. The presiding officer, the mayor, can do the following. The mayor can say on a certain set of rules, or identified in the book, what he or she can say we're going to suspend. So the mayor can say, you know, for this matter, I'm going to suspend the rule that says we're limited to 5 minutes to speak. Nobody objects. We're not going to be limited, okay? The presiding officer, the mayor, can suspend the rules, okay? So can you. I move to suspend the rule that says we're limited by 5 minutes. Second, you vote, it's suspended, even if the mayor doesn't want to do it. Even though the mayor is a parliamentarian, you have the power to declare certain rules suspended. That's in the book. And here's an important one we lawyers love, and this is it. We have these rules, and sometimes we don't follow the rules. Why? We may be lazy, we may ignored it, we didn't think it was a big deal. Most common one is this. Everyone spoke for 7 minutes or 10 minutes, and we didn't follow the 5-minute rule. Does that mean when we're done and we made our decision that our decision is now invalid because we violated our rules? This rule says no. If you violated the rules and no one said boo about it, that's what you wanted to do. This is the lawyer's favorite little bailout here. No one can come back to you and say, you didn't follow your rules, if you didn't follow your rules and nobody objected. That's how it works, okay? This is the favorite lawyer rule. So, class and priority I'm not going to dwell on. The motions in the book are so few that you don't have to worry too much about whether or not we have to rank our classes in priority of the motions, or whether they're in order or out of order. When you have 96 motions, like in Robert's Rules of Order, you do have to know this really well. You don't really need to know it. It pretty much plays out of its own, so I'm not going to spend time on the class and priority, but if you happen to be a geek about how motions are made, you can review that and you'll say, okay, I got it. Points and motions. This is the last part of the book that we need to pay attention to. There are two things called points and motions. Points are these. Points are situations in which you, as a person, as a governing body member, can shout out without the floor. Okay? You don't need the floor to make a point. There are only 3 points that you can make, and these are them. So we're all sitting here debating, or we're discussing, something's going on, and you can say out loud, point of order. The mayor will stop everyone and say, wait a minute, whoever's speaking, just a minute, we have a point of order. What's your point of order? A point of order says that you want to bring the body into compliance with the rules. We're not following our rule. For example, point of order, what's your point of order? Well, City Council Member Smith has been speaking for far more than 5 minutes, and that's not allowed under our rules. So you'll deal with it right away. You get the floor to address the point, and that's it, and you move on. The mayor makes sure we get into compliance with the rules, and we go forward. It may require a motion to waive the 5-minute rule, whatever it happens to be, we get back on track. That's a point of order. You do not need to have the floor, and you don't need a second. Same thing with the point of information. You don't have to wait for the floor, and you don't need a second. Point of information is this. I need some information in order to continue to participate in this meeting, and I need it now. It's urgent, okay? Good example would be you have 2 people who testify. One says that at the intersection there's 500 cars per hour during peak times, and somebody else said 5,000. I don't understand which number is right. Point of information, the mayor says, what's your point of information? Can we get clarification on whether it's 500 or 5,000? The question is answered, and you move on. The person who had the floor gets to continue with the floor. The point of information is to get information out that's urgent. It is not to give information. Point of information, what's your point of information? I'd like everybody to know that the way I look at this is as follows. No, that's giving information. The mayor has said you're out of order. Stop. Go back to the person who had the floor. Point of information is to get information. Can also be this. Point of information. What's your point? Can we turn the heat up in here? I'm freezing to death. That'd be a point of information, okay? Not a point of order. Nothing in the rule book that says what temperature has to be 68. Point of appeal is not that common, but this is a situation where the mayor says this vote, for example, this vote has to be by majority of the body. And you say, wait a minute, that's not right. I'd like to appeal the decision by the chair, by the mayor. Not that common, because you can also use a point of order. But if you really formally want to take on the presiding officer, you can place on the floor a point of appeal, and then the body would decide that, vote on it. We think the mayor's right or wrong. Those are points, they do not need the floor, you blurt them out, you don't need a second, it's all about efficiency. As to motions, there's only 8, not 96 like in Robert's Rules of Order. There's only 8, because these are the only 8 that I and the other people who have helped me with this book identified as the ones we use. We don't need any other motions because these are the ones we use. The most important on this list, perhaps, is the principal motion. You may know this as a main motion under Robert's rules. The reason why we don't use main motion in Bob's rules is because main motion in Robert's rules is confusing because the words main motion are used for 2 different purposes, and it's very confusing under Robert's rules. So we just call it a principal motion. This is anything you want to do. This is the motion to approve. This is the motion to decide that the swimming pool is going to be closed on a certain day. This is anything you want to propose to the body to do to make an affirmative action, to change the status quo, falls under this category. It is a debatable motion. Obviously, when you make these motions, you want to talk about it. So it's debatable. The motion to continuous postpone, as I told you before, continue and postpone has the same meanings. So basically, you make a motion to continue or postpone something. It's going to be to suspend something into the future. The rules tell you got to make 3 decisions, whether you want one of 3 decisions, whether you want to postpone it indefinitely or continue indefinitely, means it's never going to be brought back, or you want to postpone it to a date certain, which means here's the day, here's the time it's coming back, or indefinite, or without a certain date, which means that, for example, I want to continue this because we need some more information. We don't know how long it's going to take to get the information. So you ask your manager to get a report. Manager's got to allocate resources, doesn't know when I can bring the report back to you, so you postpone it until such time that the report's done and it comes back at a future date. So this is a motion to continue or postpone.
So you don't have a motion to table?
No, no motion to table. That's because it's very confusing to a lot of people when I've asked them, what does a motion to table mean? And they come up with different answers. So we decided to go away from this idea of tabling because we all use continuous postpone. Now, does that mean you can't add one in? Yeah, you can add a motion to table in there if we all know what it means, right? Just that it's very confusing.
Well, my favorite part of a motion to table is it's not debatable.
Yes, and exactly. Not debatable, and then people have to move to bring it off the table. Just continue it. You know, it's easier. Motion to close debate is the situation where we're all tired of hearing everybody talk. Okay, so we're done. We have a motion. We're debating the motion. I'm done with the discussion. I want to offer up the idea that we're going to shut up. Let's quit talking about this. It takes a supermajority to quiet everybody up. So you get a motion to debate, motion to close debate. Second, mayor says, okay, it's not debatable. This motion is going to say we're going to stop talking about this and go to a vote. Vote. Supermajority, 2/3. If you get 2/3 of the body saying, yes, we're done talking, you're done talking. Okay? It's not uncommon, but it does happen, but it's not that frequent that somebody moves to close debate. It's also called a motion to call the question, but that's kind of confusing, so we just call it closed debate. I want to stop the debate. It could have been motion to stop debate, but closed debate sounded cool.
Real quick clarification. I think in all my experience, it's always calling the question. Somebody will blurt out, I would like to call the question. It is not done by motion. It is just a interruption. So.
Yeah. So if you're the mayor, as you are, you would say the following. Somebody blurts out, I call the question. You would point out properly, and the rules identify that you can say motion to call a question. It means the same thing as closed debate.
Okay.
The rules say that, number one. But you would say a motion to close debate or a motion to call the question is a formal action that needs a 2/3 vote of the body. It's not something that can be blurted out. You need to have the floor and make the motion. That's how it works. So if the debate's going on and you've gotten in the queue, you've raised your hand, the mayor gets to you, that's the point in time when you say, I move to close debate or call the question. And it's a motion, it's not a blurt out, right? It is common in communities to blurt out, okay? And it's rude, quite frankly, because you're all engaged in debate. And so to trump somebody, to blurt out, say, I don't want to hear you talk anymore, I'm going to blurt out the idea that you're going to shut up, is kind of rude in government. And so we require you to have the floor to make a formal motion to close debate or call the question. And then you'd put it to a vote. Not debatable once it gets a second. The motion to reconsider is a necessary motion, although it's very rarely used. And there's a real good reason why it's necessary. A motion to reconsider says this: we made a decision, a decisive decision. Remember, we had a majority vote, or the required vote on a proposition. It's a done deal. We decided. How do we convert that over? How do we just go back and think about it again? This is a motion to reconsider. It works this way. If you're in the same meeting in which we made the decision, or you're in the very next regular meeting of the body, you can do a motion to reconsider. Not any time after that, because we need a decisive, definitive time in which things are final, right? But we can modify things by doing a motion to reconsider. And it requires you to, if you're going to propose the motion, that you're on the prevailing side. So you voted on the motion that you want to reconsider. You voted in affirmatively for it. You thought it was a good idea, but now you thought about it again and you want to change the decision. You want to reopen it up and talk about it some more. So if you're on the prevailing side, and at the same meeting or the next meeting, you can ask to reconsider the decision. If it passes by 2/3 of vote, in other words, 2/3 of you believe that, yes, we need to reopen this, it takes the yes or the yes to the proposition that you made, it opens it back up to continue debate. And then a new motion would be necessary. But you got to have the 2/3 vote. Why is this not used very often? Well, usually the decisions you make are the decisions you want to live up to, and you don't really go back and change them later on. So that's number one. Number two is that it gets very confusing to go back, especially the next meeting, and go, I want to talk about it again, and then bring all that information forward. It's very clumsy to hear this thing go on. And in a quasi-judicial context, developers hate it. Because I came to you and I got approval, and you all said, yes, motion to approve. I went home, celebrated, popped the champagne, and the next meeting, there's a motion to reconsider the yes vote that I got. Does that tick off the developer? Yes. Is it allowed by law? Only if you have a rule to allow it. Otherwise, you're done. And that's what the law says, okay? There are cases across the country in which a motion to reconsider was offered, and if the rules allowed it, the judge says, okay, the developer who got the yes, or the person who was happy with your decision, was subject to this waiting period in which the decision could be reversed. And so the courts will say, cool, no problem. But if you do not have in your rules of order the motion to reconsider as an option, courts say you can't use it. So we like to put it in there. We want to put it in there on the rare occasion you may want to go back and reconsider. The 2 or 3 times I've ever seen it in my career has been justified, and it's always resulted in a conversion of the decision back to a no, for example. The most recent was there was evidence that was not fully vetted. So somebody came back and said, you know, I went home, I thought about it, I slept on it, I didn't like the decision, I really wanted to know more about the contamination that was alluded to during the discussion. I want to reopen the decision and learn more about that. And what resulted was it got reopened by 2/3 vote. It got postponed so a report could be done on the purported contamination. The report was brought back, all of it was reconsidered and discussed again, and a new motion made and a decision made. So that's an example of where it could be an appropriate use of a motion to reconsider. It's a tool that you won't use very frequently. This guy over here is going to walk you carefully through it because it's a very difficult thing to do, but it can be done.
In my experience, we've only allowed motion to reconsider on the next regularly scheduled meeting, right?
Yeah, or the meeting itself, or the next regularly scheduled, that's in our
So
rules.
a 2-week time frame.
Yeah, normally.
Okay.
I do
So the
have,
point of clarity would be is though it has been allowed with consent of the council to occur during a special meeting when the mayor has declined a special meeting, and under charter, 2 council members have forced a special meeting, which reaches quorum. It essentially was a waiver of rules. that you allowed that motion for reconsideration to be placed on the floor.
But that wouldn't be allowed after that 2-week time frame. You're saying it could be done sooner, but after that, it could not.
Your current rule, your current bylaws, as what he refers to them as, but your current rules and regulations require it to be the same meeting or the next regular scheduled meeting following the day when action was taken. However, again, in practice, as courtesy to fellow council members, you have allowed this for consideration at special meeting. I don't mean literally you, the councils of the past have.
I don't recall that happening particularly, but it would make sense because it does, the next regularly scheduled meeting is the latest that it can happen. So I think if a special meeting intervened, it would be appropriate. I think that's how we've interpreted it.
This was a special meeting called by Ward and Rachel.
No.
I can't remember what the decision was about, but it was a split.
I actually have two other things on this issue. I'm sorry?
She was talking about, Sarah was talking about a meeting that Ward and Rachel, I think, brought back a motion to reconsider, and I believe that was about Ward's questioning about some process.
Yeah. I don't recall, but it would be consistent, I think, with our rules.
Yeah.
But I have two questions on it, and that's what I was trying to look here. You still, anyone can move to second
Yes,
the motion. You don't have to be affirmative.
correct, yes.
What if a person wasn't present at the meeting? Can they move to reconsider?
Can a person who wasn't present, they cannot move to reconsider because they weren't on the prevailing side?
Okay. I've always heard that debated, and that's always been the position I've taken. I wasn't sure. I wanted to make sure you addressed it specifically.
And Mr. True will advise you this way, especially on a land use matter, if you do a motion to reconsider, especially if it's at the next regular meeting. Here's how it plays out. It's very, very required to do this. If you move to reconsider a matter and it opens it back up, okay, you don't immediately go to the consideration if it's quasi-judicial. You must provide new notice, because that developer who's popped the champagne and went home, went back to Maryland, and you are not permitted to go back and talk about the matter until he or she has noticed that you're going to that you reopened it. So what the mayor will do is, if the motion to reconsider is successful, they'll say, thank you very much, we're going to reopen this to reconsider it. We will need to provide process, and you'll turn to your attorney. What is the proper you'll need to schedule a meeting in the future. The reconsideration does not have to happen at the same meeting or the next regular meeting. The motion to reconsider has to be, not the reconsideration itself.
It just puts it back on the table.
Puts it back. And then lastly, the motion to executive session. We're not going to belabor that. You're a relatively sophisticated community. You've done a lot of executive sessions and you know how to do the motion. In smaller communities where I teach, I have to take them through because they don't even know the basics. And so, but that's all in the book. You can read about the requirements on how to hold an executive session, what's required. As Mr. True knows, the law is changing as we speak, pretty much requiring us to have a higher level of disclosure when we hold executive sessions. That's just the nature of our courts right now, but it's a very important motion. You have to do it exactly the right way. You guys do it right because I know you do. So we're not going to belabor an executive session motion. So this stops the segment of the discussion about the rules of order and why they're necessary, why they're important, what they mean, and how you do things. And so I've taken some questions along the way, but it'd be probably appropriate before we switch gears to remote meetings to talk about any questions you have about process on meetings. You guys are easy. Okay. Do you want to take a break, Mayor, or we just keep going?
We'd like to keep going.
Keep going. Okay. All right, so I was asked to also address the very ripe issue of remote meetings. I do not know where you are in the game on how frequently you do remote meetings, and what I mean by remote are what we call virtual meetings. People on the screen, for example, who don't necessarily are not in the room. This is a hot issue across the state for a lot of communities on whether we should or shouldn't, and if we do, how. Because it's a very complicated issue to try to address. It's not simple. And so many communities have gone forward with remote or virtual meetings without any kind of policy to tell them how to do it. And that is a problem because there are some pitfalls in how you conduct the meeting when you have people on the screen and you're trying to hold things like public hearings. I'm going to leave for later the fact that we had a House bill in the Senate, or in the legislature, our last session, which tried to muck this whole thing up and force communities to go to remote meetings for public hearings. That bill was a disaster. It did not go far. It didn't get didn't get traction. It's going to come back next year, I guarantee you, in some format in which we're going to be imposed upon to do some kind of remote or virtual process for certain kinds of meetings. But for right now, the question that's before most governments is, should we do this? Should we do this? And so I want to talk about the kind of pros and cons and the policies behind it, and then the potholes that are associated with virtual meetings. Because this is a hot ticket item. Everyone wants to do it, but they don't really want to talk about it very much. I want to tell you before I give you my thoughts on it is that I don't favor one or the other. You know, every community is different on whether or not, how they want to conduct their meetings. It would be something you put in your bylaws. We allow for this, and this is how we do it. My most sophisticated client has a very detailed policy on conducting virtual meetings. It tells us when, how, where, why, what, because they want to walk the right line in how they do meetings. But a lot of communities don't have policies. I'm very old school. We have historically in this world conducted in-person meetings, and that's the only kind. We know them. We love them. We know exactly how they operate. And there's nothing in the law that says we have to hold remote meetings today. None. You don't have to do it. But we are getting the pressure to do it by the public because it's relatively easy to do. We now have platforms and apps that allow us to do it relatively easily. And so we're getting pressured to do this. But I'm an old school guy. I think that if you care about government, you get in the room. But I understand the pressure that we're getting. So let's talk about eyes wide open on the implications of doing the different kinds of meetings. We have to look at the benefits and the problems or detriments or potholes that are created if we're going to go in that direction. And a lot of it depends on what kind of remote meeting you want to hold, what kind of meeting, because the rules are different with the different kinds of meetings that we have. Obviously, you can do only in person. We know how that works, and no one's allowed to call it in, okay, at all. After that, there's a bunch of different ways in which communities do remote meetings. We have some that are trying to go to fully remote meetings, where both the governing body members as well as the public and even staff are calling it in. There might be one staff member in a room to do the computer system, but for the most part, everybody's on the screen. There are very few communities who are doing that. It's become kind of difficult. It takes a highly sophisticated chairperson to make sure they're getting everything done, and it's sometimes very inefficient, but it can be done that way. But the hybrid ways of doing remote meetings are becoming more common. And when I see hybrids, they kind of wash out this way. We have what I would call mostly in-person meetings, in which you all are in person. You have to be here, you're in the chair, you don't get to call it in. But you're going to let citizens and applicants decide whether to be here or be on the screen. Sometimes some communities may say, no, the applicant on a quasi-judicial matter has to be in person, but everybody else can be on the screen, including that applicant's advisors or engineers or whatever they happen to be. And it's kind of a hybrid because you've got people all over the room, in a sense, on how you conduct this meeting. They can be in person or remote. Citizens can be remote. We have some variants of this kind of situation in which we allow certain kinds of applicants, as I mentioned, to have to be in the room. Citizens can be in the room. If they're going to speak, they have to be in the room. If they're not going to speak, they can be on the screen and just observe. There's so many different variations on how you want to conduct this stuff. As we look at which kind of system you want to have, once you decide what you want the format to be, then you got to make up rules to make it work, okay? And it gets a little complicated, but let's go through it, okay? And lastly, the other hybrid I'm seeing a lot of is communities who are doing in-person, but streaming the meeting in a way in which the people who are watching online don't get to participate. So what it says to them is, I want to speak. If I want to be in the game, I need to be in the room, but I can watch, essentially, on TV. but there's no ability for me to reach into the room from the screen, okay? I just get to listen. Some smaller communities I'm working with are doing it that way. And they think that's good and transparent because at a minimum, the people on the screen are hearing what's going on in their government. But if they really care, they'll come down to their room. Okay? The issue with regard to when we pick our kind of format that we want to do, number one concern we always have is this idea of due process and fairness, that when we conduct our meetings, we want to be fair. So if we tell everybody that by being on the screen, you have full access to everything that's going on in the room, it's just like people who are here, that's, as I hope you recognize, a layer of complexity to make sure that that person can participate just like if they were sitting here. And if full participation is a requirement, if you're going to open it up to say to people, we're going to be fair to everyone. If you're on the screen, you're treated just like you're in here. And that adds a layer of you better make sure your policies are in place and your system works if you're going to do that. The issue of CoA, the Open Records Act, Open Meetings Law, Open Meetings Law applies. Colorado Open Meetings Law applies in the sense that if you're going to tell people that being on the screen is like being here in person, you got to make sure that they're treated like they're here in the room. In other words, they have to stay on the screen being able to hear and speak just like if they were in the room. Because otherwise, if you don't allow that kind of situation, then it's the same thing as telling somebody who's in the room to leave. And if you would never do that to an in-person person, say, I'm sorry, sir, you need to leave the room. You can't listen in anymore or speak. If you don't have the system working on the screen where they can do that with you, if they're shut off, they can't hear, they can't speak, you can't hear them, it's no different than knowing this person, they've got to leave the room. That creates this due process issue, this problem of fairness and open meetings violation, because now that person isn't going to can't be in your meeting if you're going to allow that on the screen. I hope you see the complexity. It requires that your system work. And that's number one. And a lot of communities have tried to go into remote meetings with very, I'll call it lame computer systems, program systems, where they keep cutting out, the person can't be heard, you can't hear them, they're not getting the link anymore, they tried to link in, they can't get in. There's all these problems that are created, and you must make it perfect. Because if you don't make it perfect, you may have to postpone the meeting because you've closed the door to the public when that person can't participate. So remote meeting participation can be challenging. You have to make sure that your system works. There's some great pros to using the remote system. We get more people involved in our government. We can allow for ADA accessibility through the system, which I won't touch upon. Mr. True can go deeper into how the ADA plays into remote meetings. It's become very easy to do this. A lot of communities I'm working with have great systems and microphone systems that are beautiful, that have no defects and always work. And they're great for addressing emergencies. When you have an emergency circumstance, hopefully never, you can get the governing body in a room to make a decision. So pros are great. The cons are problems. The cons are problems. One, it's kind of expensive to make sure you have that system that works that well. Okay, many communities do, some do not. The inherent limitations are if it doesn't work, you probably have to postpone the meeting, which can be a real problem. The issue of managing decorum in meetings when it's remote is a big deal right now. The barking dog, the airport or vehicle attendance, which I'm seeing more of, where the governing body member or a citizen is participating remotely, but they're walking through the airport, and it's unnerving to have that situation play out, especially when it's a governing body member. In New York City, just by way of a funny story, there was a governing body member who had a traffic accident while participating in a meeting remotely. And that was a big deal for the screen because the person now they lost their quorum, if you will, because the person had an auto accident. We have a lot of problems with our computer systems and our app systems allowing for speaking over, whereas if you're talking to somebody next to you, the microphone system will only pick you up, then you cut it out, so only you're caught and not anybody else, and it blanks somebody else out. So the system has to be one in which the mayor manages the people who are speaking very carefully, so you don't have crinkling paper. that at the microphone, that blanks out the microphone system, you know, that noise, the noise cancellation system. And we've had a lot of problems with volume changes, where the person on the screen is extremely loud, whereas the people in the room we have to tone it down and bring it up again for different people who speak at have different power input into the room. These kind of practical problems come up in these remote meetings, and they have to be things that we know about going in. Some of the bigger problems that I'm struggling with is the ability in the remote situation for people to review the documents being handed around. Okay, so we have a packet of information that went out, and that person who's participating remotely got to read the packet, and they know everything that's in the packet. But during the meeting, somebody goes, I have some new documents I want to hand out. Well, this person who's supposed to be treated like they're right here in the room has no access to that information. Does that mean you have to postpone the meeting? Thankfully, I don't get to answer that question for you. He does, okay? Because it's a problem right now. What does that mean? The law has not told us what that means when that person can't participate fully because they're not there to see the document. Do you need to stop the meeting and post on the screen the documents that are being handed out so everybody can read them before you reconvene the meeting? We don't know. We don't know because the court's not telling us. The law is not telling us. There's a lot of aspects of quasi-judicial matters in which people appear before you, and you're the judges, as you know, and you're allowed to judge the credibility and veracity of people who speak to you. And the way in which you do that most oftentimes is watching their body language, okay? And you get less of that when people participate remotely. You do not get to see their body language oftentimes, especially when they don't have to put their face on the screen, or all they put is just their picture, or just a blank screen. And they tell you what they think, and you have to judge their credibility and their veracity. Or typically, you would see them speak to you, and you can tell whether they're telling you the truth or not, or you get to decide. You lose that in this meeting format. And then you have a lot of nonverbal explanations in the meeting where people will point at things. Like right here, when this road comes over here and goes over there, you know what that means because you saw it. The people on the screen don't get to see that. And so we have these problems on what does remote participation really have to provide? And the answer is we don't really know yet. We haven't gotten enough experience to decide that are these kinds of problems significant defects that say our system is going to make it impossible for us to hold a fair meeting or allow public participation the way we're supposed to. In one community I've had, we had what we called bombing. And other communities have had this too, but the one I got to experience was one in which we allowed remote participation and the person got on and blared profane music into the system. And it caused a scramble for everybody to find the button to turn it off. And then the question is, do we have to shut this person down permanently? What if they call in another number, which they did? They called through another source into the meeting, and that was a problem we had. And they delayed the meeting by some 20 or 25 minutes because they were bombing the meeting, upsetting the meeting intentionally, okay? And so those things do happen, hopefully not here. And there's a great deal of need in our There's a great deal in this kind of situation to have a very astute mayor. It's because here's how it plays out. You're watching 30 people on the screen, and you may have 30 people in the room, and people are raising their hand. Who do you call on first? What's the system by which people get to speak? Do you have to inquire with them? Are the people on the screen, how many of you are here to speak in favor? And they hold a hand up, somebody didn't. Oh, well, they get to speak later. And the mayor goes crazy trying to manage this kind of meeting when you have very complicated meetings with lots of players. But that's the nature of allowing these kind of meetings to happen. You will walk into situations where they're too clumsy to manage effectively, and they can be very inefficient. So be aware of that going in. Be aware of that. Two other issues that we struggle with that are usually addressed in policies by communities who want to allow some type of remote participation is with regard to the governing body members having full access to information. So in quasi-judicial matters, some of the communities are saying you cannot, as a governing body member, participate remotely if it's a quasi-judicial matter. So let's say you call it in from Minnesota, and you're in the meeting, you make a bunch of decisions with the body, you're participating, you pass a lot of legislative things, and now you have a quasi-judicial application where the applicant's going to be talking and pointing at maps and handing out papers, and you're on the screen, and you're the judge. So some communities are saying you cannot be a judge. You recuse yourself because you cannot participate to the same degree that you need to be an effective judge. You can't hear, see, touch, feel the meeting like you would if you were here. So some communities are not allowing governing body members to call it in, to remote in on a quasi-judicial matter. And then the executive session issue comes up fairly frequently in the policies too. Most communities are not allowing governing body members to participate in executive sessions remotely. And the reason for that is what may be a lack of trust, I'll call it that you do not know whether the person on the screen, the governing body member, is tape recording the executive session or has somebody else in the room with them. And that's a mainstay in executive sessions. They're confidential, correct? And so why would you allow that possibility to happen? And so some communities, if I would say most who are going to the system, do not allow executive sessions to happen remotely for governing body members. A few have started to move in the direction of allowing for certifications, where if you're going to participate remotely, you certify on the record that you are alone and you're not recording the conversation. And it's a trust level, do you trust them? And so some communities are going to saying, we need to get you in the room, so we're going to allow you to do it if you pledge to us that you're a good boy or girl. That's a system that we're seeing. So the bottom line is that if you're going to have remote, decide what kind of remote you're going to have, get policies put in place to manage issues like executive sessions and quasi-judicial, make sure your system works beautifully, test it out, have a policy that decides what you're going to do when things don't work. And be aware of situations in which people say, I can't hear you, and you do not know how to fix the problem because it's on their end. It's on their end. Their problem is with their system. You cannot control that. But yet they're going to claim that they were denied fairness, denied an opportunity to speak, denied an opportunity to participate because of their system failure. So we have to manage all this stuff. And I don't know how to manage it best right now. I can provide to Mr. True a copy of perhaps the most sophisticated remote policies out there that we've drafted. And you can probably build upon that, and any perfection you do, I would love to see it, because this is all a learning and process situation that we're having in our state to address it. But be aware that next year we're going to see legislation that may force us to allow for two-way communication in meetings. The bill that came out would have done so, and whether you're Montezuma with 65 people or you're the city of Denver with many more, you would have to allow public hearings to be done remotely, two-way communication. Think about that for somebody like Denver, and think about it for somebody like Montezuma and the cost associated with that. When in Montezuma, everybody lives next door to the town hall and walks into the meeting. Now you have to provide a means by which they can call it in and bear the cost of that. So this issue of fairness is going on among communities, and we've lobbied very heavily at CML to make sure that the state legislature recognizes the problems associated between communities, but we're not confident that we're going to get a good bill if it comes to that, because remote meetings are becoming the demand by the public.
The other issue that I would like to ask you about is the fact that courts themselves have gone to virtual meetings fairly regularly, but I'm not aware of any court that has made a decision. I'm not aware of any cases that have been filed to say this hearing was remote, the council member wasn't present, it was unfair. I mean, are you aware of any cases that have been done that way?
I'm aware that there are courts that have gone to remote practice and then reverted back because of the problems associated with it. Communication problems and just a general, now the pandemic's over and we don't need to do this anymore. Because more so than local government, the court system has been very much an in-person thing because of body language and everything else, right? And so more courts are switching now that the pandemic's over, going back. With regard to some courts, especially municipal courts, they're finding it too easy to continue to do remote. It just works so well because the chips aren't as many on the table, and you're oftentimes doing arraignments remotely, which have been done for a long time, and that's an easy thing to do. If the person doesn't connect with the arraignment, then you just postpone it, that one person. It's easy to do. And so we're seeing a mixture of types of remote situations in the courts.
But my question is also, the second part of my question is, has any applicant who was denied approval in a remote context sued that you're aware of?
Has anybody who denied access sued?
Yeah, so who's denied an application? Because this has been my concern, is that in whether it's HPC, PNC, or whatever, where there was a remote participation, and an applicant got denied because too many neighbors zoomed in, and they felt that was unfair because it was remote. Are there any cases in litigation now on that issue?
I am not aware of any, and I'd be surprised if we saw any, because it's no different than, say, a community says, we're going to get a lot of people to show up in person. Let's move the meeting to the local high school so we have greater participation. And the developer's saying, no, too many, that was unfair to me that you allowed too many people in the room. I'd be shocked if we saw that situation come up. But I can envision, if I haven't found any, but I could probably find some situations outside of Colorado in which someone argued that they were treated unfairly because of the remote situation. They weren't heard, they couldn't hear, they couldn't see the documents. I could envision that issue has come up somewhere, but it's not been reported to me.
Yeah, and the other case is if you allow council members to participate remotely, whether that's going to be deemed, and the applicant's denied, whether that's going to be deemed an unfair process.
Don't know about that. I do know that we have some solace in the fact that there are some cases out there in which people have challenged the court proceeding as being unfair because the judge was blind, and that didn't fly.
No.
That the courts would not go to a position of saying a blind judge is unworthy of hearing and deciding a case. So we have the ability to use that kind of decision in defending ourselves in the fact that we have some limitations upon hearing and seeing and speaking. We may have to use those to defend ourselves should we ever get these kind of decisions.
Because we have been allowing council members to participate online, and I have been concerned about that in the quasi-judicial context.
And as you should be concerned about it, more and more communities are talking about it, and more communities are limiting the quasi-judicial access in that regard. But the issue's been around for a long time, because in the early 90s, I drafted Park County's telephonic parts. This is before the internet, right? Telephonic participation. They were having problems in getting the county commissioners in a room because of weather conditions in Park County, because they live so far away. So we created a means by which they could call it in, which was very unique at the time. But that's become a very common thing to do today, to call it in.
Yeah, for us, we have a lot of different situations. This topic mostly came to the surface in Historic Preservation Commission meetings and with neighbors wanting to be able to remotely participate. That was kind of the loudest that we've heard of this. We've been accommodating as we could be in our city council meetings. As Jim was saying, we've had remote counselors. We take public comment remotely. And we've had issues with both of those, whether it's poor communication or we did have one evening with a few callers that were, I would just say, off color, if you will. So we've had a couple struggles. I think for us, we're looking at specific instances, right? HPC is different than the council meetings and the others. Most people want to be in person. It is really when they are prohibited from doing that they want to choose the remote option. But I guess my only question around this would be about our ability, and this isn't necessarily for answering because we may not know, but are we going to be in a position where one size will have to fit all? So whatever we do here at a council has to be employed in HPC, P&Z, a number of our boards and commissions that we have. So that's really, for me, my only concern going into this is as we keep continually looking, number one, we're looking for staffing and technical backup to make sure that works. If we don't have that, then there's no even reason going there because it's not gonna work. So once we get those items kind of ironed out and we have solid footing for that, then the next is really the application of it, where and when, and can it be different for different issues? Obviously, I think under our rules and regulations, we could probably have our own regulations around council member participation. But if we start putting in different regulations for applicants, presenters, for example, to say, oh, well, in this case, you have to be in person, but in this kind of hearing, you don't have to be in person. That's where I think it's gonna get a little bit sticky. Obviously, it's gonna get sticky for those people that are out there looking for the opportunity, and if it's available in one area, why isn't it available in another area, et cetera. I do share the concerns that you just said, though, about if there's a denial of an application and council members were remote, I would think that, well, in the experiences that we've had, it would probably be pretty easy to assert that it was not necessarily fair and equal access of information. So if there was ever a denial, I would see, an appeal of that pretty quickly, I would think. Because I would think you'd be able to say, yes, this is obvious to me that the one council member that wasn't there who voted no was not privy to the same information and didn't have the luxury. So there's concerns around it, but we've really handled it in different ways in different areas. We've experienced all the challenges in one form or another.
Yeah, and I think I still fall back on the idea that if you're gonna go there, write it down, what your expectations are, put it on paper so that you can show people, the reason why we did it is
This is how we
this.
do it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the simple policies in Centennial is that they've given themselves the right to shut the governing body member who's participating remotely off if they cannot make two-way communication and it's disruptive. This is not confidential. We had a governing body member who was calling it in, repeatedly was falling asleep and snoring. And that's where the policy came from, is the ability, what we call the finger policy, to turn it off. And so we have the mayor say, we are having problems hearing you, you're not it's disruptive, and we turn them off. And so that had to be written down. Otherwise, how do you tell that person, you get cut off? We didn't have a policy.
Well, you don't wake them up.
Gotta wake them up first.
Oh, wait, what?
This is why you need a policy. Clearly two different viewpoints.
We will wake you up first, and then we will tell you you're cut off.
And what and some bodies have asked me, says, well, Bob, shouldn't we ask the public what they want? And hopefully you heard me say there's so many other issues besides just the ability to participate. Because what you'll hear from the public is absolutely, it should be remote. So I can stay at home and watch the ball game on one TV and watch the city council on the other. I want that access, and that's what I want. But they don't understand the problems associated with it on the bigger picture. The public's not well versed to make that decision.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come up and talk with you, because one, it's been fun just for me to come up to Aspen again and have a couple days off. So now I had to go back to the grind in Denver. So, but I appreciate the offer, and by all means, contact me through Mr. True if you need to, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I have offered communities, if they've adopted Bob's rules, to both keep in touch with me about things they've tweaked, done differently, because it may come out in the next edition on some other ideas. I want to keep up on that, and I'm being happy to answer questions for any community across the state on the rules, and whether they're my client or not, doesn't matter. I just want people to get the best situation they can in their public meetings. So
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would recommend that this recording is kind of held in a place that is easily available for onboarding new council members in the future. It'd be great for them to just go through this. I have a feeling we'll probably make some modifications to how we have our rules and regulations coded now. So I think this will be helpful in the future.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
I just want to say, and when we were talking about being in the room is the most important part of really the job, I think, because you can miss so much, body language and so on. I'm always more excited when I see our local news reporters in the room than watching on TV. Thanks.
Bet.
Thank you. Any questions for us?
I don't have questions that need answered today, but I would encourage you to each individually think about whether you would like to remove Robert's Rules of Orders from your rules and regulations and move towards Bob's rules. And that will give me some clarity about how I do this with a lot of things. So, right, I'm still waiting for direction to update your rules and regulations. I have all kinds of questions that only you can answer for that to be a useful document for you. You have directed us to do a charter review. There's some interplay between what the charter says and your ability to adopt these rules as they're currently stated. So we'd like to just provide you clarity of those trade-offs for your decision-making. And then, one of the things I'd say about the rules and regulations is that they've been on a 20-year update cycle. And 2025 is year 20 so they were done in 85, 2005, and again, hopefully here this year or early next year, you'll be ready to do that again. I'd really encourage you to do that before a new council is seated so that all of this hard work you're putting in gets memorialized and really set the foundation for future councils. I'd be happy to talk with any of you more individually about that if you have some questions or thoughts about that as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Bill?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Sam and John, what we're answering is yes, we would like to clean up our rules and regulations to remove Robert's Rules of Order and move to Bob's or some form or amended form of Bob's Rules of Order, correct? Correct.
Correct.
I want to simplify parliamentary rules.
Great.
Meetings.
Yeah.
So yours truly, since everyone else is on vacation, will be writing the work session follow-up, and you can let me know if I got it right or not.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
AI is not there yet for you?
We have AI on our running.
I want to say thank you to GrassRoots. We'll be back next week. We do not have our regularly scheduled meeting for Tuesday. It is next week. And thank you always. Have a great evening. Have a great week.